So again, if you've been with us for the past 4 weeks, you know that Peter is, well, as we've written over there, Peter is many things. And he is often this sort of all or nothing kind of guy. He either is strongly resisting Jesus or earnestly drawing closer to him. And while it can be easy to laugh at Peter when he gets it wrong, this morning, I think it's worth noting that even after last Sunday's scripture where Jesus rebuked him, Peter remains open and teachable. He continues to show up, hungry to learn. And not just about ideas or beliefs, but to these ways that Jesus calls us to live into, to give our lives to. And that's no small thing. I mean, how many of us after a moment like last Sunday where Jesus is firm with Peter would remain open, would continue to raise our hand in class and ask questions, right? How many of us would continue to lean into the discomfort and learn rather than closing off and withdrawing and becoming bitter? It's not an easy thing. And so for all of his faults and foibles, Peter continues to show up. And this morning, as Jesus is teaching, Peter leans in again. How many times should I forgive? He asks. Not that I have anything or anyone that I'm struggling to forgive. Hypothetically, I'm asking for a friend. How many times should one forgive? Right? It's the kind of honest, earnest question that is more than hypothetical. Like, if you were to ask a question about forgiveness, it's probably because you have someone in mind or some situation that you're struggling with. It's not just theoretical. There's probably something more going on there. Peter, perhaps like many of us, he expects Jesus to give him a simple, straightforward answer. Up to 7 times? He even answers his own question, right? Showing that he's being generous, not just once or twice or even 3 times, but up to 7 times? Not 7 times, Peter, Jesus says, but 77 times. Or actually, as the Greek could also be translated, 7 times 70. That's 490 for those of you who are keeping score. Right? So even Jesus' math, when he answers our questions directly, is ambiguous. And with Jesus, that is often the point. Can we follow Jesus beyond simple answers to dwell in grace and somehow stumble our way forward? But even as I say all of this, I have to admit that there's a part of me that is hesitant, reluctant to preach a sermon on forgiveness, which I know probably sounds a bit strange because it's quite literally at the center of our Christian faith. But actually, I'm hesitant because I believe in forgiveness from the depths of my being, because so much of our culture and expectations around forgiveness, including so much of what churches and Christians preach, has next to nothing to do with what Jesus is about or teaches. And so I'm hesitant. There's a part of me that's hesitant because this word has so much baggage around it that one sermon cannot possibly do it justice. For instance, forgiveness and its counterpart, reconciliation, which is not the same thing. They're often conflated, but that's one myth. They're not the same thing. But they are both often weaponized in our world by abusers, by people in positions of power, people who generally refuse to accept accountability for their actions. Right? We assume wrongly that if someone forgives another, that means that they're saying there don't need to be any consequences. You're letting it go. And so forgiveness is all too often used to guilt victims, people who have experienced an offense, into maintaining relationships with abusive people, right? You just got to keep forgiving them, hold out hope that they will change, even though they show no signs of wanting to change, even though the relationship continues to put them at risk for harm. Just keep forgiving. That's what we're taught. But that's not what Jesus teaches in this passage. And we assume wrongly that forgiveness is like a one-time thing, a one-time decision that you make, and that to forgive means that I can't or I won't feel angry anymore once I do so. As if somehow I say, you know what, I forgive you, and magically that just erases all the human stuff I've got going on inside of me. We assume wrongly that forgiveness is some spiritual way of bypassing our grief and our anger, like some get-out-of-emotional-jail-free card. But it's not. There is no way around all of that. The only way out is through. I believe in the power of forgiveness and the new futures and beginnings that it makes possible. I do. But just as true forgiveness is powerfully life-giving, distorted forms are powerfully destructive. And it's important to name that because so much of what each of us has in our minds for what forgiveness is and does and looks like comes from those distorted, destructive forms in our world. And it's significant that Jesus is teaching this morning on the absurd, illogical, mathematical formula we call grace doesn't begin with forgiveness itself, but with that larger process of repair, of which forgiveness is just one part. Did you notice that in this morning's reading from the Gospel of Matthew? Right, in the way that Jesus lays out and calls us to journey down, when someone has sinned against you, which before I go any further, I feel like I have to touch on that word because of its baggage, sin. The Greek word that Jesus uses here, that is used throughout the New Testament, is amartia, and it literally just means to miss the mark. In short, to sin is not merely about a list of rules that we need to follow. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't have sex before marriage, and if you do one of these, you've sinned and you're going to the bad place as punishment, right? To sin is a way of speaking to how our words and actions miss the mark of that which is needed to honor a relationship. And therefore, it just is meant to refer to these ways that we wound one another. How our words and actions rupture relationship, break trust, tear at the fabric that ties us and binds us in community, sometimes in spite of our best intentions. And so it's not merely, saying drinking is bad, wagging your finger, but it's about how something like drinking can become problematic when it causes disruptions in our relationship, when it begins to tear at the fabric of a family. That is what sin is trying to get us to see, how our actions cause ruptures and tear at the fabric that binds us together. And when that does inevitably happen, as it will for each and all of us over and over again probably, when that does inevitably happen, when a relationship has been ruptured, when words and actions wound, what then do we do? Again, Jesus begins not with the question of forgiveness. He begins with accountability. He doesn't say, go to that person and let them know you forgive them and see what they do or say. He says, go to that person and point out the fault. Point out what they have done, how it affected you. Don't begin by telling your friends or complaining to others. Don't begin by going to the boss, calling the manager, talking about them behind their back. Go to the person involved and correct them. Tell them. The idea is to begin with a conversation and sharing how something has affected you. Do not go and start shouting. Do not begin with blame. Do not try to weaponize shame to make them feel bad and coerce them into changing their behavior. Right? We all know what that leads to. More of the same. If I make you feel like a piece of crap for getting it wrong, then you do that to me when I get it wrong, and we get stuck in this cycle. Now, many of us have probably fallen into these various blame and shame traps on numerous occasions. I can't claim to be blameless myself. I struggle with these too. I think it's part of our being human and struggling honestly together. And we probably will all do it again. But if we want to hold out hope for breaking this cycle, for the possibility of true repair, then we have to begin differently. And beginning differently, as Jesus lays out for us, looks like gathering the courage to tell someone how what they did hurt you, how it wounded you, how it impacted you. That's not an easy thing to do, because most of us, if we've done that, have not experienced someone being very responsive and compassionate. And in response, it also looks like that person who said or did the thing that hurt the other person, having the courage to truly listen, to truly hear what's being said. Which is to say, rather than beginning how probably most of us begin, which is with defensiveness, with a, yeah, but, rather than shifting blame to someone else, before you work through any of the content, it begins with simply validating and acknowledging what's being said. The harm done. Whether you intended for there to be harm or not. And here's the thing. We know that hurt people, as they say. And so when we don't honor a relationship, it's usually because we ourselves are in pain, are stressed out, are hurting, a need is not being met. And so a larger process of repair will ultimately attempt to make space for this as well, that we are both hurting, and both of us need someone to bear witness to that pain in order to move forward together. But this isn't meant to minimize how one's actions have been destructive or to negate the need for accountability. Those things somehow have to be held alongside of the sharing of pain and the grace offered to one another. Right? This process requires deep soul searching from everyone involved. And if you can do this, Jesus says, then you've regained them. You've won them over, which is not about saying you beat them. Ha, you lose. I'm right, you're wrong. The courage and patience and vulnerability, is to say, have regained that person, drawn them back to those ways of life, the life-giving ways, rather than these ways that disconnect. And you can begin to move forward again. But if the other person becomes defensive and refuses to listen, Jesus says, then, yeah, you're probably going to have to get someone else involved. If you really want hope for that future together, to move forward together, then you might have to get a couple of mature, trusted people. Don't get into a battle of he said, she said, going to different people yourselves. Bring someone there with you together. Let these trusted people be witnesses and mediators who can hear each of you and help you hear one another. And through this process, maybe you can begin to find a way forward, a way to repair. Now, at this point, if someone is still being bullheaded, most of us, whether in our families or in our church or in our wider communities, are given the wisdom to just let it go. right? You're not going to change them. They just are who they are, and you need to move on. And what oftentimes ends up happening in our families or in our churches and our communities is that when someone has experienced a betrayal, when someone has experienced an offense, they end up in this position where they just have to stay stuck there and wait for it to happen again. Right? There's no accountability. The person, by being bullheaded, has essentially learned that by refusing to cooperate, I can just do that every time and get the same results. I don't ever have to have the accountability. And so I'm just going to do that same thing every time. And so on the cycle continues. A bully continues their same behavior, and the victims are forced to be subject to it. Unless, again, they, the victim, remove themselves from the situation. But Jesus, in this morning's scripture, Jesus doesn't force the victim, the one who's been betrayed or experienced the offense, Jesus doesn't force them to leave or remain subject and allow the offender to sort of, quote unquote, get off scot-free, continue without consequence. Rather, he says, if this person continues in their unrepentant behavior, if they're unwilling to change, unwilling to acknowledge the harm that they've caused, then Jesus says, treat them like a Gentile or a tax collector, which might not make a whole lot of sense to you sitting here today listening in. But to Jesus' Jewish audience, it would have been quite clear. See, a Gentile and a tax collector were two categories of people that you didn't try to convince to change. Gentiles were those who lived by a different set of community and relational standards. You just weren't in those close bonds with them. You might engage in business with them. You might interact with them, but there's no deep relational ties. And a tax collector was a Jewish person, someone who was part of your sort of family, your kin community, who had effectively chosen to leave by their actions, who had betrayed their people for their own economic gain and self-advancement. And so Jesus is saying, those who refuse to engage in processes of repair, who refuse to be accountable for their action and be part of this forgiveness process, they have effectively chosen to remove themselves from the community, from the web of relationships and the commitments that are needed from one another to honor each other and make relationship possible. So at some point, you might just need to let them go. Let them remove themselves. Which I know is a profoundly painful experience for everyone involved. Not just for a perpetrator, but also for those who have been violated and offended. And so most of us, we stay stuck in these cycles because either accepting accountability or letting go is too hard. But Jesus says that you do not need to continue to subject yourself to another person's violence, physical, emotional, whatever it might be. You deserve more. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly, Jesus says. Let them go if that's what they choose. And this is where we return to Peter. Because Peter's question comes in this context of, well, if someone does choose to be accountable for their actions, to participate in this larger process of repair, then he asks Jesus, then how many times do I need to forgive them? Before I can let them go like that unrepentant person. And I wonder here, as I listen into Peter's question, I wonder if there's a part of him that's sort of looking for a loophole. Like, what's the least amount that I have to do? I'm willing to do it 7 times, but is that enough? Can I move on then? And we've probably all been there, right? I'm tired of forgiving this person. Why can't they just figure it out and stop doing the wrong thing for once? How, after all of these months or years, are you still doing the thing? And it's in this difficult, familiar situation where someone is willing to acknowledge their sins, willing to acknowledge how they missed the mark, but because they're human, they will screw up again. It's in that context that Jesus offers this absurd, illogical, mathematical formula for grace. Not 7 times, Peter, but 77 times. Or 7 times 70. The number is not important. Don't focus on the number. Don't keep score, keep track. There is no number. An infinite number of times, Peter. As part of a larger process of repair, if you want to stay in relationship with someone, then that's what's required of us. The Greek word Jesus uses for forgiveness here is aphemi, which means to let go or to release. It's in this context that we begin to let go. To forgive is not to say that what happened doesn't matter. It's not simply to sweep it under the rug, let it go, and move on with nothing changed and pretending like we're not angry or feeling anything anymore. But instead, as some people have referred to unforgiveness, as refusing to forgive, as being like drinking a poison and then expecting someone else to die to experience the consequences, right? Unforgiveness, refusing to forgive, leads to bitterness and resentment within ourselves. It begins to corrode our own humanity. And so to forgive is first of all an act of releasing these chains that bind us to the harms that others have done to us. I am not defined by what you have done to me. I release that power, that hold that you have over me. It's an act of radical freedom for oneself first. And in a world where our wounds and our pain become justification for doing violence against others, forgiveness becomes a revolutionary act of relinquishing that. Right? We're still going to feel all the things that we as humans feel when someone has wronged us, but we choose to break the cycle of acting on an eye for an eye. And while we can forgive and we can still remove ourselves from a relationship, forgiveness is a commitment to honoring others' humanity, believing that they can change. We can hold out that hope that they can change, but that is their work to do. You cannot do that for them. And sometimes they will not begin that work until you let them go. Even if that means remaining open in the spirit of forgiveness to potentially welcome them back when they do. See, forgiveness is neither the beginning nor the end. It's part of a larger process of repair, but it is what makes new beginnings possible. And we'll see this power again in a few weeks, after Holy Week, after the crucifixion, after Peter has denied and deserted Jesus in his greatest hour of need. We will see once again the power of forgiveness. We'll return to that. Just as many of us will continue to make those mistakes and need that forgiveness ourselves. May those new beginnings, friends, be possible for you, too. For your healing and repair, for the healing and repair of all the world. Amen.